This is the second in a series of lectures centered on Enrique Dussel's book from 1975, Philosophy and Liberation. In this talk, we're going to look at the preface to this book and chapter one as well. We'll begin with the epigraph of the book, where Dussel cites his own 9-year-old daughter at the time. "There is no peace. They even tear up the flowers." Well, something's being torn up. And Dussel's philosophy operates out of what is being torn up and what is not giving at least a lot of people some peace. I think that's where this book is coming from. Now, the structure of the book, there are 5 chapters. There's a preface. Chapter 1 is about history, which we'll talk about in this lecture. Chapter 2, from phenomenology to liberation. Chapter 3, from politics to anti-fetishism. Chapter 4, from nature to economics. Chapter 5, from science to philosophy of liberation. And an appendix, philosophy and praxis. Now, we won't get a chance to talk about all that this term. There's a lot in here, but I've tried to pull out some of the key points to give you some food for thought. Now, the preface. Who is this book written for? His intended audience, he tells us, is neophytes in the philosophy of liberation, newbies, so to speak, us, since we're taking philosophy of liberation for the first time, probably. It's for beginners in this line of thought. And we should quickly say, though, that the book is not written for beginners in philosophy as such. I think that in many respects, it does presuppose some ideas from the philosophical tradition that he writes out of and he writes over against in many respects. Still, despite the way Dussel writes, despite the complexity of some of the ideas he wants to express, I think we beginners can get a lot out of this book. We may struggle with the aspects of it, but I think we could do a pretty good job of it if we just take our time and are careful. He says this book is not exhaustive. It's not a complete accounting of all his views about philosophy of liberation, where it comes from, how it operates, and what its purposes are. But it's an overview. He says it gives a provisional theoretical philosophical framework in his terms. And when I read that, it reminded me of something that Aristotle writes near the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, where he says, the only thing I can really do here is to give us an idea of how it's best for us to be, roughly, and an outline, he says, roughly and an outline. He says, I can't write a book that tells you exactly what you ought to do in order to be the best you can be. There are reasons inherent in what it means to be human that would prevent that. In fact, it would make efforts to try to do that futile, if not actually dangerous. And I think philosophy of liberation is on the same footing as Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It can only give us the rough outline of what this philosophy might look like, how it might operate, because in a key feature of philosophy of liberation is that it operates out of a context, a specific place and time for specific persons. And we are all necessarily diverse. So you can't write a book that would just tell you in the end exactly how it's going to be. I think another example of this we could give from the history of philosophy is Marx and his ideas about communism. He writes exhaustively about all the problems with capitalism, a very exhaustive critique of capitalism. And then he says, at the end of history, meaningful history, will come communism. And if you asked Marx, well, what would that look like? He has very little to say about it. And one of the reasons he has very little to say about it is because we have not been free in the way that we would be free, he thinks anyway, debatable, but in his philosophical view, we have not been free the way we'd be free under communism. So who knows? Who knows what we would do with our freedom? One last example along these lines is Heidegger in Being in Time. He writes exhaustively about inauthenticity, or what Jean-Paul Sartre would call bad faith, which Sartre does in his epic work, Being in Nothingness. Being in Time, Being in Nothingness, those books tell us about bad faith, about inauthenticity, about how we are not as best as we can be. But when it gets to authenticity, there's a problem, because you can't say in advance. If a philosophical text were to tell you what being authentic exactly would look like, it would be repeating the very thing that those texts are trying to critique. This idea that what it means to be human and how it's best for us to be comes prepackaged somehow. And we just have to get lucky enough to find the philosopher who packaged it for us. Well, that won't work. And not only will it not work, it could, in many respects, be dangerous to our efforts to try to attain freedom and authenticity. So Dussel's in good company here. There's only so much I can really say about that. He says this book is written in the sorrow of exile. And we talked last time about how all the philosophers that we've been focused on this semester operate out of a kind of exile, which brings with it a kind of a sorrow, but also maybe some opportunities, as we'll see. He said, this relies on my memory. As was mentioned before, he didn't have his books. He was on the run. His house had been bombed. He and his family had to flee the country. And he just went with whatever he could carry. And he's trying to do his work as a philosopher by himself from his memories. And he says this book now has been written from the periphery. And we talked again last time about how central this idea of place as constructed from center and periphery, about drawing boundaries, and how every time you do that, for whatever reasons you have for doing that, something always kind of gets excluded. And Dussel's going to argue again and again that it's at the periphery where things get really interesting. For those of you who are business majors, profits are always at the margins, right? That's where the exciting stuff happens. And it's the same thing Dussel's going to argue in philosophy. It's written from the periphery for persons and peoples of the periphery. What he means, again, is the excluded, the misfits, the non-being, the maon, the nobodies, the nothings. What about them? The ones that are excluded from the center. He says, but even though that's where I'm writing from, and ultimately that's what I'm writing for, or who I'm writing for, the book really addresses all of us, including those of us at the center of the present world system. And I think that, we would have to say that that includes us. So this book has something to teach us as well. Now, in the preface, he says this book is an ensemble of theses, quote, calculated to foster a certain type of thinking. I've emphasized that over the course of this semester, that these are not so much doctrines to be memorized and internalized and judged against other doctrines. It's not so much about doctrines. It's not so much a what, really, but more of a way of being philosophical, a way of pursuing truth and beauty and goodness, a way of being human. And Dussel says my book is meant to get something going. He says, I hope to provoke a worldwide philosophical dialogue. Well, he's gotten his wish. He's known throughout the world, and here we are at the center talking about his works. So he's had some success for that. He says this book will use the language of the center even as the book is at the service of the periphery. And we met this issue before in Ignacio A. Carrilla's text about trying to develop the philosophical foundations for a Latin American theology. So the problem is we need our own way of thinking. The problem for us is that we've been kind of co-opted by the thinking of the rich capitalist North American somewhat democracies. We've been captivated by them and captured by them, and we think their thoughts. We got to stop doing that. We got to learn to think our own thoughts. The problem is you can't start from scratch. You can't just invent a language whole cloth. You can't just invent a tradition of thinking whole cloth. We have to start with the language of the oppressors. We have to start with the language of the center, as an A. Carrilla or a Dussel would say. Why? Because we would never understand who we are and we would run the risk of reinventing the wheel. There have been problems that have been addressed, but maybe imperfectly, maybe with unintended results. But we need to know those. We need to start from there. So it's tricky, and Dussel knows that it's tricky. That, as we mentioned earlier, the problem of a genuine Latin American theology, a genuine Latin American philosophy, is an ongoing struggle. How to do that? You can't think outside of Plato and Aristotle, Kant and Hegel and Marx and Heidegger and all these thinkers. You can't think without them, but you got to think beyond them somehow. That's the trick if it's going to become your own. He writes, the slave in revolt uses the master's language, and that's how he looks at it. He thinks that this philosophy of liberation will be postmodern. It will be popular, not in the sense that everybody's going to read it and everybody's going to buy his books. It's not going to be Harry Potter, but it's about the people. It's for the masses of people. It's intended to address the concerns of the masses of people. And he said it's a pro-feminine philosophy. The women have been neglected in the canon of Western philosophy. We don't read the women philosophers because they didn't get as published as well, as made known as well, as taught in the schools as well. We're all a victim of that. Who knows what we've been missing? That's one of those voiceless groups over time, over long periods of time, that the voice has to be restored. And he thinks the philosophy of liberation will help to restore that voice. And he says it's expressed by, quote, the youth of the world, the oppressed of the earth, the condemned of world history. So that's what's this about. This is this issue we've been raising from the beginning. Can we, at the center of world history at the moment, understand and think from the position of somebody else, the somebodies who have not had it as good as we have? Can we do that? Is that possible to do that? Can we think from a position of non-being, of what is not? A. Korea says you got to immerse yourself in reality and what is really going on, what is, but you also have to have an eye or a nose for what might be, and what might be isn't yet. So the non-beings of this world also point to possibilities, potentials, and can we understand them and find our way to something better through them. All right, that's the preface. So the first chapter is entitled History. And he says the purpose of this is to present and analyze the historico-ideological genesis, prioritizing the spatial worldly setting of the matter to be explored. There it is again in so many words. It's about place, setting the place for where this philosophy can take place, starting from the reality of the situation, both of the subject matter and of its own status as a critical philosophy, which I think you know by now that I'm raising problems for, questions for. How critical can this critical philosophy be? How's it going to work? Now, space for Dussel is not some kind of abstract, empty, or idealized Newtonian space, the stuff you study in geometry. When philosophy thinks of space in those terms, it means, well, I could do philosophy anywhere. It doesn't matter where I start. It doesn't matter where I am or who I am, because philosophy is a universal endeavor, equally accessible to all, wherever they may be. Dussel says that philosophy tends to present itself in that utopic way. We've heard this term before, utopia, no place kind of a mentality. To state the obvious, no place is no place. There is no place that you could stand that would be like that. Space is about fixed territories. Like I said, draw that circle. You will always include some within the circle, and by definition, you will exclude some from that circle. Hopefully, a process of liberation would be in a continued expansion of that circle in some kind of way. The philosophers of the dialectic that Dussel is going to criticize think that we can finally one day get to that place where everybody's included. There's no outside to the circle, but he doesn't think so. Space is about fixed territories, about drawing those circles, and that means space becomes a kind of a battlefield. To repeat, the key spatial arrangement for Dussel is center and periphery. When you fix a territory, you get both. He writes, political space includes all existentially real spaces within the parameters of an economic system in which power is exercised in tandem with military control. We don't have one without the other in this world. Now, he offers us a graphic that made sense as of 1975. That's a long time ago for us right now. But if you take a look at the diagram, you can get a sense of what he has in mind here. You'll see Europe is at the center, and there's sort of a dividing line, not in the middle of Europe, but more towards the one side. Most of Europe is on the count as one of the capitalisms, the giant of capitalism, of course, the United States at that time, and Japan. A little bit of Europe tends to the socialism side, where you'd find the Soviet Union. China, you would see, would be more towards the periphery than the center in 1975. That certainly can't be the case today. India and Southeast Asia are also tend towards that side, but they've probably shifted, as is China, more towards the capitalism side and more towards the center in many ways. You could see Africa and the Arab world, Latin America. It's just a diagram that tries to show you that there is a center and then there's outside the center. And the center is dictating how we think, how we operate. It is the determiner of those material conditions of production and distribution that we talked about that makes the world go, including all of our ideas. And then there's this periphery. And Dussel argues that philosophers have tended to be philosophers of the center, but the really interesting ones, as it turns out, were actually operating at the periphery. And he says, philosophy is born in this political space, and he to repeat, when it's born in the periphery, where the thinking comes out of being not counted, not at the center, not seeing things the way everybody tends to think is the natural, normalized way of seeing things. He says that's when it gets creative. When it gravitates towards the center, as it tends to do, it tends to degenerate in its creativity. Now, I think you can hear a little echo of Aya Korea here with the critical and creative aspects of philosophy, or if you want to use different terms of his, ideologization and disideologization. When you're at the periphery, you're disideologizing. The ideology is the ideology of the center, the overwhelming or hegemonous view of the world, those lenses, and you're criticizing that. You're showing the cracks in those lenses. You're showing the blind spots in those lenses. You're seeing what doesn't get seen in those lenses, and something new happens, something fresh, something creative happens. When those lenses do start to harden and solidify, and the questions start to end, and everybody just thinks they have it all figured out, that's when it degenerates into ideology in the negative sense. And let me just say it here, I'll say it again, I'm sure. For Dussel, ideology is always negative. He doesn't have that view that it's in some ways neutral. It can be good and necessary, but it also can devolve into something that blinds us to what's going on. That's the way A. Korea looked at it. For Dussel, when he uses the word ideology, he does mean it as a negative. So when philosophy is alive and creative, it's coming from the periphery, it's born in the periphery. When it gravitates towards the center, when it starts to become, all acceptable and the questions start to end, it degenerates. It's no longer philosophy, it's now ideology. He writes in section 1131, the book is divided into all these subsections. Philosophy, when it is really philosophy and not sophistry or ideology, does not ponder philosophy. It does not ponder philosophical texts except as a pedagogical propedeutic to provide itself with interpretive categories. What's he saying there? Philosophy, when it degenerates, starts to be about itself. There's always a self-critical element, or ought to be, in philosophy. That's important, as A. Korea pointed out. But it tends, especially in academic settings, to be thinking about books or thinking about other philosophers. So much intellectual capital is invested in trying to understand what philosophers thought, rather than trying to understand what it ought to be talking about. Now, he's not against reading text, just like A. Kriya is not against reading text. Dussel reads a lot of text, studies a lot of important historical, philosophical, and theological texts. Certainly he does. Why? They're helpful pedagogically. Propedeutic means a helper. It helps us learn things, right? It helps us understand the categories with which other people are thinking and how the world gets constructed in the ways that it has. But philosophy should be about reality. Philosophy should be about the world, not about itself, but about the world. Not about philosophers, but about reality. Philosophy ponders the non-philosophical, the reality. But because it involves reflection on its own reality, which it should, it sets out from what already is, from its own world, its own system, its own space. The philosophy that has emerged from a periphery has always done so in response to a need to situate itself with regard to the center in total exteriority. It's different to study philosophy from the center when you're just talking about our traditions, as we like to say, like who we, but our traditions. We start talking about the text because those are the texts that we talked about. The periphery talks about those texts to see how they came to be excluded. Right? It has real world implications, not just a matter of passing intellectual interest. And he says, as he said, the good stuff happens at the periphery. He says, take pre-Socratic philosophy, which gets the whole Western tradition going. Thales of Miletus, for instance, generally given the pride of place as being the first named philosopher anyway. He says, look, he wasn't in Athens at the time. That was the center. That was New York City of the time. It was the center of the center. No, it was out there in Turkey and southern Italy where Thales and Anaximenes and Anaximander and Heraclitus, they were at the periphery. They weren't in where everybody already kind of knew what they were supposed to think. Look at Descartes. Descartes' story, his personal biography, shows that he was not in Paris at the university studying. He was a mercenary. He was on his way back from fighting a war for money, and he got he had to hole up in a cabin somewhere coming back, and the weather got bad, and he just sat there and did his meditations. He tried to, almost like the Buddha, he tried to sit there and figure out what he can know with certainty. That's what he wanted to know. That's where we get that famous, I think, therefore I am. That's the one thing I'm absolutely sure about, is that I'm thinking. Everything I think could be wrong, but I'm thinking. I'm sure of that, right? And that got modernity going in part. Right? Descartes is one of the founders of the modern way of thinking, and it happened outside the centers of thought. That's where the change came from. Kant, who had his aforementioned Copernican revolution in philosophy, he worked in Königsberg, not in Berlin, the intellectual center of Europe. No, he was on the outskirts there, where the air was freer in some ways for him to think. Taking this further, he writes, distant thinkers, those who had a perspective of the center from the periphery, those who had to define themselves in the presence of an already established image of the human person and in the presence of uncivilized fellow humans, the newcomers, the ones who hope because they are always outside, these are the ones who have a clear mind for pondering reality. They have nothing to hide. How could they hide domination if they undergo it? Right? Dussel's going to argue that the traditions of philosophy and theology are the product of a system that has unjust facets to it, that have domination as part of its reason for being. Philosophy as ideology to solidify the thinking, the views, the lenses of the status quo, just like Marx said in that base superstructure model that we talked about. Philosophy develops out of the center's way of doing things, so it tends to mask domination. But if you're being dominated or excluded, you got nothing to hide. Right? Somebody else is hiding from you. That's at least the way he's putting it here. How would their philosophy be an ideological ontology if their praxis is one of liberation from the center they are opposing? Philosophical intelligence is never so truthful clean and precise as when it starts from oppression and does not have to defend any privileges because it has none. Now, in the slides, you'll note that ontology is highlighted in blue text. And remember our color coding from before. Blue, the mnemonic to remember this is blue is bad, at least in Dussel's mind, and red is right on, at least in Enrique Dussel's view of things. So what are we talking about here? Ontology. Generally, ontology is thought of as an ology, a study of ontos, to on, beings, study of beings. That's it. Study of beings, pretty academic, maybe sounds kind of abstract, the study of being as such. But think about it. Ontology, that effort, determines which things have being and what kind of being they have. Which things count as being and what kind of being they count as having. When you say it like that, Dussel says you can hear the ethico-political valence of this otherwise seemingly abstract academic activity of trying to figure out being, like in the philosophy department. It's a negative term for Dussel. He gets this negative connotation of the term ontology, which most philosophers think is just very neutral, like epistemology or ethics. He gets it from Emmanuel Levinas, who himself makes the distinction between metaphysics, which Dussel is going to like, we're going to eventually write that in red, and ontology, which Dussel is going to criticize. He says, ontology, the thinking that expresses being, the being of the reigning and central system, is the ideology of ideologies, the foundation of the ideologies of empires, of the center. Classic philosophy of all ages is the theoretical consummation of the practical oppression of peripheries. Now, what's another way of thinking about that? There's a line of reasoning here. Ontology studies the question, what is? What is there? What has being? And what kinds of being does it have? Once you make that determination, what has being, you've simultaneously made a determination of what counts, what matters. Why would non-being matter? It isn't. We don't have to think about it. It's excluded. We don't need to care about it. Well, if ontology is a practice that occurs in the center, and if Marx is right, as Dussel thinks he is, about historical materialism, then the thinking of the center will reinforce the practices of the center. And the practices of the center say some people count and not others. Some people count more than others, and some don't count at all. They're not even visible. And so that last line there, classic philosophy of all ages, is the theoretical consummation, we're saying it in so many words, of the practical, real life oppression of that and those that are at the periphery, the ones who are excluded. So he thinks there is an ideological aspect of all philosophy, and the philosophies that are the famous ones, the ones that constitute our, whoever we are, our tradition, as they say, has this ethical aspect to it that's not good. It's not good in the sense it is reinforcing real world practical oppressions, giving it, as Ayakri would say in different circumstances, a kind of ideological cover for doing things. You don't have to treat those people that way because we've determined philosophically they're not fully people yet. You can see how that works, right? The center is, the periphery is not. We talked about that historical question about are the Indians, as they call them, when the Spaniards came to this side of the world, are they really human? Do we have to treat them as humans? And we talked about Bartolomeo de las Casas, and defending the reason, the rationality of the indigenous people here against the Spanish philosophical justification that says, well, they're immature, they're not really rational. Even Aristotle, he He, like Plato before him, thought that slaves were slaves by nature. A determination has been made that there are certain kinds of being. The being of those beings is slave nature. Slave nature. Well, once you think that's just what that person is, it gives you license to treat them the way you've already been treating them. And the way you've already been treating them has been taken up by a philosopher like Aristotle and given an intellectual coat of paint as a justification for doing what you're already doing anyway. So Dussel's going to say, we got to stop doing ontology. We got to start doing metaphysics. The philosophy of liberation is about that, about metaphysics, not ontology. And again, on many traditional philosophical views, these would be synonyms. You pick up a book on metaphysics, you'll see ontology. You pick up a book on ontology, you'll see metaphysics. The traditional definition of metaphysics is study of being qua being. You find it in Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. Ontology, the study of being, literally in the word, the logos about the ontos, the study of being. But they're not synonyms for Levinas, who is the great influence here for Dussel. Metaphysics, not ontology, is about creation, Dussel says. You got to think the Bedouins, the desert people, the nomads, the Semitic people, the wanderers. It's subversive and political. It understood things, prophets, systems, and kingdoms as contingent and possible, but not necessary, not set in stone. Yes, they all had systems. They all had ideology, as Ayakriya said. They all had ways of seeing things, but they held those ways kind of with open hands. It might be different. We might need to move on. We might need to see things differently. He makes a note here. Creation is a notion of radical contingency. Things could have been otherwise. God created the heavens and the earth out of nothing, ex nihilo. Didn't have to. Chose to, did, but didn't have to. It's contingent. Creation and contingency go together. So there's something creative about the subversive view that things could be different. As the anarchists say, another world is possible. Maybe other worlds are possible. In the end, metaphysics respects alterity. That word alterity just means otherness. It respects that. It doesn't want to exclude. And in weird ways, it's not in a big hurry to include by cutting corners or trying to pound square pegs into round holes. Doesn't want to do either of those things. It respects other as other, if that's doable. Ontology, not metaphysics, for Dussel and Levinas, became ascendant, became centered, and, as Dussel implies, corrupted. It turns into ideology. The kingdom of God on this view is this kingdom here, the one where I am the king. God wanted things this way. This way is the way. And any other way, the wrong way. It disrespects other ways. It disrespects alterity. So Dussel's thought, in a word, is about metaphysics. The tradition of philosophy, in a word, is about ontology. Saying with some kind of purported authority, this is what is and this is what is not. Metaphysics is, well, open. It's open to these things. Ontology, theory as comprehension of beings, holding them together, comprehension, literally, reduces the other to the same, promotes freedom in that it does not allow itself to be alienated by the other. It's a kind of a freedom from the other. It's a freedom from alterity, a freedom from diversity. I don't want to be bothered by those things. They don't really count. It renounces obligation. I have no obligation to things that aren't, at least from my point of view. We talked about this in an earlier lecture, this idea, this book that Levinas wrote called Totality and Infinity. And totality, that word here just means like my world, the way I look at things, the way I understand things, where everything fits, everything makes sense. That which is in front of me and I more or less understand what it is. It's my projects, my way of understanding the meaning of things. And outside the totality is non-being. It doesn't fit, so it isn't. It just doesn't count. Infinity for Levinas is that which exceeds the totality. And as we learned earlier, very, very briefly, infinity is that which can break into my totality, break up my totality, get me to question my meaning, take me by the throat, make demands on me in obligation, whether I like it or not. And this happens to us. It comes to us, Levinas says, from on high. And the window of this is the face of the suffering other. That's Levinas's philosophy that Dussel picked up. Okay, let's take that for the key ideas of chapter 1, and we'll move on from there.